Thanks, Ulrich. Everybody, well, I can hear the echo, so I assume everybody can hear me okay. As Ulrich mentioned, we're going to do things probably a little bit differently today. A lot of you would have heard plenty of security presentations over the years and just presenting just general facts, but I want to build this around a little bit of a story for you. So I'd like to put this slide up when I start just to show that barely a day goes by when we're not seeing a security incident of some sort. And before I do any presentation, I always do a quick look up on the media to see what the latest story is. And many of you might have seen that WhatsApp is on the news again this morning. They were hacked overnight, and for anybody wondering what the consequences are, pretty much anybody that uses WhatsApp has fairly much shared their data with the hackers. And I'm talking about all your data on your mobile phones, social media, everything. So the impacts of this stuff is, it just goes right down to the individuals. We all suffer the consequences of it, and we want the companies that we're doing business with to do better. Now, whilst thinking about this as well, I know a lot of you are part of global vendors, global companies, but many of you might have owned your own businesses. But whilst I go through this and introduce this session, I want you to put yourself in the place of smaller companies, perhaps some of your clients, and just think what would happen if you were to get a phone call one day for them, or you were to be part of the management of that company and your CIO rings you and says, I've just had a data breach. It's a fairly major data breach. At this point in time, I'm really not sure whether we're going to be able to recover from it. And to find yourself battling a fight that can go for weeks, months, years, and in the end you lose your business, you lose your livelihood, and you've got to start from scratch. Well, I can tell you that I went through exactly that scenario. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. So the company that I own was formed in 2002, a company called Distribute IT. It was formed off the back of an accreditation for .au domain names. And we built that business up from scratch. I think we didn't earn any money the first couple of years whilst we worked very hard to try and build our business up. But over a 9-year period, working 7 days a week, I think I had about 4 or 5 days off in 9 years trying to build this business. We'd built our business up into a business that had exposure right across Asia Pacific. We had over 200,000 domain name clients and 10% Australian market share, and a significant market share in Asia as well. And we had over 30,000 hosting clients, cloud-based hosting accounts across the 3 data centre setup. So we'd built our business up into something that was quite strong, and we were looking to float our business on the Australian Exchange in 2014. This incident actually goes back to 2011. But sadly, some things have changed, but some things unfortunately haven't. So I thought I might tell you a little bit about what I went through and some of the challenges that I had. And whilst I do that, and again, try and put yourself in that position. How would you deal with that? How would you deal with that on behalf of your customers? If you were to get a call from a customer, I've had a major breach, help, which can happen, of course. Perhaps your systems have been compromised and affected customers. We had over 3,000 resellers and 250,000 customers on our platform. Every single one of those customers was impacted by our breach in some way, shape or form. So it's not just us, it flows right through into the customer base. Now the slide I've put up here is actually week 2. We went through this whole breach over a 3-week period. So we were battling hackers. I actually didn't go home for 3 weeks and spent 3 weeks at the office trying to deal with this incident. That's how massive it was. The week before, the Saturday on the week before, was the first notification of a breach. We had somebody break into our networks. We noticed that some data files were missing. We weren't sure what they were at the time. Some of our credentials were compromised. And we took this very seriously at the time. We just didn't brush over it and say, well, we'll reset a couple of passwords, and just move on. We notified our regulators around domain names and hosting, the Australian regulators. We had mandatory breach reporting way back in 2002. So we declared our breach, and our regulators made us reset all 250,000 passwords for our clients and advise our clients. We also rebuilt significant portions of our network. This precedes this. Over the course of that week, reset password, replaced firewalls. You know, we just, it was an incredible week of trying to get our security measures under control, but we felt it was necessary given the potential nature of the breach. But on this particular day, Saturday, phone rang, CIO's on the phone, and I just went home about an hour before and see my kids for the first time in a week. Just starting to relax a little bit, thought we'd got a handle on things. The phone rings, CIO on the phone, he says, look, I'm sorry, Carl. He said, the hackers are back. Right? They've now got access to our entire network. They've locked me out of our firewalls, or reconfigured access into our firewalls, and they've now got control of our total network. Now just put yourself in that place for a minute. Interesting situation to deal with, isn't it? So what do? You know, we responded obviously very quickly, and we've managed to get our team down to the data centre to try and assess what had happened and try and get control, because the only way we could get control of our network again was to go into the data centre and get control in behind the firewalls. When we did that and we got control of our network, we found out what the hackers were up to. Now, rather than this be just a data breach, I mean, they're very serious, just a data breach. In our case, what the hackers had done is they'd set in place a cascading program inside our network to destroy our infrastructure. So they've taken out all our core system platforms, operating systems, billing systems, the whole works. They've taken out the backups of those systems, and we had backups. We had up to 5 levels of backups across the 3 data centres. Because it's all electronic and it wasn't something we could put on tape, you know, they could take out the backups quite as easily as well. And they were proceeding to systematically destroy whatever data we had inside our network. And we had 400 core servers inside our network, and they were working their way through from important to least important, which also told us that they knew our network and they'd been in there sometime prior and we hadn't noticed them. Now, I can tell you from that day, I spent the next 48 hours at the data centre, rebuilding networks, trying to recover from backup what we could, get a bit of an idea about how long it was going to take. And it was evident pretty early on in the piece that it was going to take a significant amount of time for us to recover. But 48 hours later, exhausted as we were, we managed to switch on our core network again, start to bring up some services for clients, but we're still in the early stages of recovery, and our early estimations on recovery was that we could potentially be down for up to 3 to 6 weeks. That's just how severely impacted. We also took a little bit of a reputational hit the week before. You know, we were offline for probably a good 48 hours at one point. Now imagine your website's been offline for 10 minutes. You're probably going to be on the phone to your providers pretty quick. Well, a lot of our customers, hosting customers, were down for 48 hours the week before, and we're down for 48 hours again whilst we sorted out our networks over this weekend. Now, with things coming back online, you take a little bit of a breath and think, hope the hackers don't come back. How did they manage to get in again? There's a lot of things that sort of fly through your mind. But we managed to get things up, took a little bit of a breather and thought, okay, let's just systematically work through. Now, what I didn't know at this point in time was all hell was about to break loose. So when I thought I was starting to get on top of things, this blew out into a full-blown crisis. Now, I'll just touch on a couple of these points here. We're a little bit limited with time this morning, but I just want to give you an idea of how an incident can blow into a full-blown crisis and how quickly it can happen. These days, it's all about social media. Now, 20 years ago, we probably would have made the news locally, and we might have had a few days to recover. Back in 2011, I sort of got away with it for 48 hours. We're still in the sort of infancy of social media and new ways of news. I can tell you, if anybody's suffering the same incident that we had today, you've probably got about 1 hour maybe 2 hours to respond. You know, I had 48 hours to try and get on top of things. When social media hits, when the media hits, it just goes rampant. We started to trend on Twitter. There was a lot of chat on forums about what we were going through, and this real momentum started to build up to the point where within 24 hours, we made front page press in Sydney. The hacking incident, the next day we made front page news in Melbourne. So I can remember looking at my business partner saying, geez, why couldn't we get this sort of exposure for the right reasons? Unfortunately, we got it for the wrong reasons this time. So we had to report our breach again. I said, I'll just touch on some of these areas. Started to have very serious board meetings around recovery. How long could our cash flows last? We hadn't really been able to trade for about 10 days. You know, that's a significant impact on any business, and certainly it was on ours. We weren't a large business. We started to engage the AFP, the Australian Federal Police. They've got a division that deals with these sorts of incidents. They got involved, and that sort of momentum started to build up to the point where we had journalists camped on our doorstep. So every time you wanted to go out for a break, leave, you'd have a microphone stuck in your face. So just imagine that sort of mounting pressure. 10 days into this, you haven't really been home, haven't slept, you're completely exhausted. How are you going to make good decisions under that sort of pressure? You know, all these sort of things, and you just feel very isolated and on your own. And this is where it comes back to sort of, you people, vendors, people involved in security, we'll be there to help your clients when they go through that sorts of incidents. I mean, that's what security is all about, providing services and helping their clients in their time of need too. Now, it's an interesting thing about customers and reputation. How long, I'll ask you around the room, a show of hands, how long do you think it would take for your business to lose reputation and start to churn customers? You know, hands up for 24 hours, major incident. 48 hours? Yeah, okay, that's not too bad. Well, I can put the exact time frame on ours. It was actually for us, it was 72 hours. 72 hours into this second week, customers started leaving us. And when customers leave, I'm not talking about one or two, they leave in a big way. And we started to churn. We were losing customers at perhaps 1% to 2% of our database per day during this period. Now, it's just how quickly it can happen. I also started to lose staff. My staff were exhausted. Some of them, oh, you guys aren't going to recover. I've had enough. Throw their hands up, resign, leave. Others, on the other hand, were fantastic. They did the 24-hour stints with us, really worked through it, and some of our people were great. It's interesting how you learn a lot about people in a time of crisis. Governing body got involved. Just to run through this, obviously media kicked up in a really big way as the back end of that week went on. We had the Australian Privacy Commissioner on our case pretty heavily because they were worried about potential breaches of credit card data and those sorts of things. So it's interesting, in your time of need, we had more people against us giving us a hard time than put their hand up to help us. People wanted to take us down rather than help. One of our competitors actually ran a fire sale offer during the latter half of this week. They called it the Distribute IT fire sale offer. Bring your services across to us and we'll look after you. So interesting just how people respond. We had to make announcements like we had lost some of our core systems completely, including all backups. So we then started to worry about things like class actions, those sorts of things. In the end, it all became insurmountable, and I think late in the second week we decided that we couldn't continue, and we were looking at options about whether or not we go into administration, whether we just liquidate. And we ended up making contact with one of our competitors who'd been trying to acquire us for a couple of years. Long story short is that we went through a full acquisition deal inside 24 hours, talking about negotiations, contracts, the whole works on an acquisition deal. And on the 23rd of June, the people from Net Registry who bought us came down to Melbourne. We handed them the keys to the business. They took over. We had to liquidate what was left. And we ended up with debts on liquidation, bank problems and everything else, and we were out of business. Yeah, and it can happen as easy as that. And for a lot of your clients, that's That's what happens when you get hit with a data breach. The reason I wanted to present this today ahead of presenting the data is I want to give everybody a different perspective. I mean, this is the real life reasons for security. You know, it's not, it's great to be talking about privacy and those sorts of things as well, but what sits underneath it is personal information. The people that have lost information have had their identity stolen, have had all sorts of problems. I mean, it's a serious issue that's impacting all of us. A lot of companies like ours are losing their business. You know, so it's a very serious issue, but it's also very broad. You know, it's not just about protecting pockets of data. You know, it's how you recover from incidents, you know, whether you've got insurance cover. Our insurances didn't respond when we went to make claims on our business. So there's a lot of factors to this to think about security. So I want to move on a little bit into the data and just keep in mind what I've spoken about this morning whilst I go through the data sets to get a feel, because obviously you probably tell I have a little bit of a different take on security and data to what a lot of companies do. But just want to go through and just touch on some of these key areas, you know, what's driving security investments, some of the challenges, who's actually running security and programs in most companies, data classification and breach. It covers a lot of the sort of elements that I've spoken about this morning. So what's driving most of the programs? Now I look at this as a little bit of a different way. Now it's great that, as I said, privacy is coming along and starting to now drive a lot of the security programs. Incident response, you'll notice that's one of the top responses there. Now, by the way, what I didn't mention here is that when we went through the data, we worked out quite quickly that a high portion of the respondees to the research said that they're still immature in their security programs. Now, only 20% of the respondees came back, and actually I've got a big chart on the previous page, yep. Sorry, only 30% consider themselves mature with security. So still 70% of organisations out there that consider themselves immature, and a lot of them have no security programs at all. And even the ones that consider themselves mature, when I go through the data, I would still consider them quite immature in certain areas of their program. So it's getting better, but it's still evolving. And I guess for vendors in particular, it still represents a lot of opportunity within the clients to help them with their businesses. So risk management is still largely driving or project requirements. I am starting to see security as a response line on tenders now, so it's good to see organisations are starting to consider that as part of their responses. Unfortunately, I'll say unfortunately, line 4 there, response to an incident. That's the old knee-jerk reaction. I've had an incident. Oh, I better do something about security. Now, it's not the best way to go about your security program, but unfortunately it's driving a lot of it. And a lot of that comes from the old saying, I guess, that it won't happen to me. Yeah, I know it's in the headlines every day, but you know, that's somebody else's problem. And I remember doing a presentation down in Tasmania, down in Hobart, along these lines, and somebody put up their hand and said, but nobody comes down to Hobart. Why would anybody care about our data? Okay. I didn't really want to answer that question, but yeah. So responses to breach, that's unfortunately driving a lot of it. Country compliance. Now compliance goes beyond privacy and GDPR as well. There's a lot of compliance requirements now in specific sectors. I know in Australia there's a specific data breach response requirement inside the financial services accreditations. We had one as well as part of our domain name accreditation, so it's starting to become now part of the broader compliance. And security programs are being driven by security vendors such as yourselves. So what we're starting to see now is a lot of questionnaires come through the larger companies, asking the smaller companies providing services, cloud-based services, what their security posture is like. So that middle tier is also now starting to sort of feel the effects of the ongoing security situation and having to up their security posture as well. So there's a lot of opportunity in that sort of mid-level vendor space as well. Now I decided to put this slide up here for a couple of reasons. Now you'll notice that the more mature organisations with security, part of the reason that they are mature is that they've got a dedicated resource for security, and that's not always possible. Large companies can afford to have dedicated resources, smaller companies can't. But it's important to have security as part of one of the core responsibilities, or at least have it as a dedicated role if possible. And you'll notice that those companies, there's a massive discrepancy there between mature and immature in terms of how they look after their security programs. And we'll notice that most of the companies that consider themselves immature, their security programs are still being run by board of directors. It might be a part-time role of one of the senior managers. A lot of cases, no IT experience, and it's certainly not a focus of the business. So that education piece for companies as well is still really important, highlighting them to what potentially can happen. And within a business, it's one of those few risks within major businesses that can bring you down. So for most businesses, it should be sitting very high on their risk register. Now, data classification's interesting. I put this one up here for a couple of reasons. Klaus touched on it earlier as well. He's saying that most companies are now getting a good feel for what their important data is: contractual data, employee data, key account data, confidential client information, those sorts of things as well. But where it starts to lack and where it starts to drop off is when we get into the back end there. You can see there's not a lot of consideration around general customer data or consumer data. So everybody thinks when they do their data classifications and assessment, they're thinking about what's important to them. What is the core information that's important to them? So in our case, there might be contracts that we have with clients or our personal information and so on. But we need to start thinking about what's actually important to somebody else. What's important to a hacker? What might not be important to me might be really important to somebody else. It might be of value to somebody else. So we need to think beyond that. So when we're classifying data, we need to think about the importance of data outside our network, what it might be worth to somebody else. Now, I've got a short story that I like to share with this. There's an energy company in Australia, and I won't mention their name for obvious reasons. They had their core usage data compromised. So a hacker broke into their networks, got access to their usage data. When I'm talking about usage data, it's just statistical information broken down into the household, so household address, when energy was being consumed inside the different houses. There was no financial data or anything of that nature. Doesn't sound too important, right? Well, the hackers that got access to the data sold that data off to a criminal group in Australia, and the criminal group was able to work out from the data provided when people were at their homes and when they weren't at their homes. So they could work out and predict certain times of the week or weekends when people weren't at home. So you can probably guess what followed. A whole spate of burglaries as a result of this. The energy company had no thought as to what that data might be worth or worth to somebody else, but it was valuable to the hackers. So we need to sort of think outside the square a little bit when it comes to this. Cloud. We can talk about cloud for the next 10 years, I think. But this touches on quite a few different areas. It's the security of the cloud. It's also the passing of the risk. A lot of companies I talk to think that I've got my information up into the cloud, so it's their problem. It's not my problem. You can't transfer the risk. Love the slide, Klaus, with the buck stops here, because that's exactly what happens in this case as well. If it's your data, you own it, you're responsible for it wherever it is. So if you're dealing with cloud providers, they're providing services to you, you need to ensure that they're doing the right thing by the data. There's a lot of cloud providers that will share your data. There's a lot of cloud providers that will sign you up on contracts that are unfair as well. There might be limits of liability. So if they have a breach, you can't make a claim against them. And in turn, insurance companies won't cover you for a breach if those limits of liabilities are in place with those contracts as well. So it's a very big issue, and it's important that it's treated seriously and that everybody understands those core elements of where the data is and who has access to it and how it's protected. And think about those core pieces. And that then goes on to our breach, the readiness for breach. Now this slide was put together a little bit in terms of notifications and how we can communicate in terms of breaches. Not a lot, probably sort of half of emerging companies we can see are ready to notify the regulatory authorities and notify customers of a breach. It is a requirement under the Emerging Privacy Acts to notify customers of potential breaches, and that's in writing as well, and advise them of remediation actions. Can be quite expensive. You know, I think the average cost to communicate a breach to a client and help them is over $100 a record. So if you've got significant data that's been breached, it can be quite a significant cost. There are basic requirements being meant to announce it on the website. Nobody really does that. And a lot of companies, as you can see by this, have absolutely no notification process in place, or they're working through trying to improve their platform. So this is where, again, it comes down to that broader, you know, it's just not about encrypting a piece of data or protecting a particular server or a network. You know, it's right down to understanding a breach, managing a crisis if you find yourself in one, involving how you're going to notify your customers, how you're going to notify the media, exactly what you're going to say. In my particular case, we took the stance with media of saying nothing. Was that a good idea? Don't know, probably not. Didn't really help us at the time, but we also thought, well, whatever we did say was probably going to be misconstrued and go against us as well. All I know is one of our staff members said something that they shouldn't have, and that's what ended up on the front page of the news. So yeah, it's difficult. So also with this as well, have you nominated people that do speak to the media? Everybody else should shy away from it. You know, have your representatives that know exactly what they want to say, they're trained to deal with the media, and they're prepared with their messaging. And being prepared in advance is always better than trying to deal with an event when it unfolds. I've just touched on cybersecurity there. Look, that's a whole issue in its own right. Anybody that's dealing with data or data breaches that's got a standard insurance policy, a business interruption policy that's not cyber, 100% of those will not respond to a cyber incident, even though a lot of the brokers will tell you that they will. We had a business interruption policy, and it did not respond in our case. I never got a cent out of insurance, and we had quite significant policies in place. But even cyber policies may not respond as well, because cyber policies can be quite generic as well, so they may not cover you for your specific risks, the client's risks. So going through the process of understanding what the risk is, you know, I always say with companies, it always starts from the basics, get an understanding of what the risk is for a company, where their important assets lie, you know, how they're protected, what is the consequence of a loss, what does it look like for them, how much do they really need to insure, and so on and so on. It's good to see 70% of mature companies embracing it, not so many of the evolving companies, but that still tells us that 30% of companies that consider themselves mature don't have any insurance in place when it comes to a cyber event. Just finally, where is all the money going? There's still a lot of it's going into application security, network infrastructure, so perimeter protection. We're seeing a lot more security spend now going into security operations, sort of live monitoring of systems, SOC and SIEM solutions. Identity management is growing. So the focus is still a lot in those areas. I'm probably, in some respects, a little bit disappointed to see that there's not a lot of money going into handling of breach, understanding what a breach is, getting the executives trained, understanding what their role is in the breach. I still get odd questions from board members when I speak to them. I had somebody recently say to me, "Hey mate, Don't tell me about this stuff. Just tell me how much money I need to throw at you to get it sorted. So yeah, there's no amount of money that can go towards security because it's an ongoing problem. So it's not easy to deal with. But as you can see, this is where the bulk of the spend is. These slides are going to be shared later on anyway through the platform, so you've got plenty of opportunity to access the data. So lastly, just the key takeaways for me, and there can be plenty of takeaways. Still, a lot of companies consider themselves immature. Now, for vendors in the room, that should light up the eyes a little bit. What that means for vendors is opportunity. There's still plenty of opportunity. Even within our mature organisations, there's still a lot of weaknesses in certain elements of their security programs. But I've found that the best way to introduce security into these firms is just to get in and just do the basic assessments, gap analysis work, just a basic security assessment, give them a bit of an idea of where their weaknesses sit. Because I still see a lot of money put into security to buy a product or a service without any real understanding of how that's actually dealing with their broader security problem. So it's great to sell products and services, but if the company you're dealing with understands their security posture and where their weaknesses are, that's a greater opportunity to add more services into the range with companies. Yeah. Second one's pretty obvious. We'll all deal with that, response to incidents, but getting ahead of the game is key, and understanding the real risk and having the value of a structured program in place I think is important. So that finishes my presentation. Thank you.